Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you're not on the East Coast. I am glad to join you today. I'm Judy Spigarelli, a Customer Success Manager here at Blackbaud. And I'm excited to introduce you to Creston Jamison from Ruby Tree Software. I'm going to share a quick housekeeping slide, which you've probably seen already if you've been to any of the sessions, but just as a quick reminder, the webinar audio is through your computer speakers. Please reach out via chat if you're having any challenges, and the recording will be available within 24 hours. So let's get right to it. Welcome, Creston.
All right, thank you, Judy. All right, let's go ahead and get the presentation shared here. All right, hello everyone. Hope you're having a great BB Dev Days. And thank you for joining this session to talk about Blackbaud Integrated Payments using the Payments API. All right, so I basically have three objectives with this presentation. One, I want to tell a good story. Two, I want to teach you about the Sky API, specifically the Payments API, to be able to implement it if you're interested. And third, not to overwhelm you with code. So there's definitely code in this presentation because it is on the pro code track, but it's used very minimally throughout the slides. A lot of slides don't have a ton of code in them because a lot of implementing the Payments API is getting the boilerplate down that doesn't involve code. The code's relatively minimal to get it set up. But let's get started. So story time. So we had a prospective customer come to us for our product called Advancement Form, and specifically the events module of Advancement Form. And this prospective customer was already using Blackbaud NXT, and they wanted to be able to build an integration with it to be able to send those event registrations into NXT and as well use Blackbaud Merchant Services. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so just a little bit of background about myself and Advancement Form before we get started. So my name is Creston Jamison. I've worked at 2 different universities over 12 years. During that time, I oversaw development and advancement services during most of those years. And I founded Ruby Tree Software looking to develop a more customizable online giving and event registration solution. So Advancement Form is the product that was built. It does online giving and event registration. We onboarded our first clients in 2013. Since that time, we've processed hundreds of thousands of form submissions, served hundreds of thousands of constituents, and helped our customers raise hundreds of millions of dollars online. And just a few things, what makes Advancement Form different. Number one, it's incredibly flexible. There's many different ways to design and run your event. The next is that it's easy to register for sophisticated events. So if you have a reunion with 30 different activities taking place over a weekend, you can register for all of that in one form with Advancement Form. Now, the next area is that it's very conversion focused. So we really want to maximize the registrations once someone lands on the page. And lastly, something we call next level support. You're probably thinking, what does that mean? It basically means whenever we ask customers what they like about Advancement Form, so many of them say, we really love your support. And some of them even say you're our favorite vendor. So that's always nice. But enough of that. Let's go ahead and continue with the story. So we had this prospective customer come to us and they said, we want to make our reunion registrations easier. We need to handle a lot of new moving parts, multiple activities happening. The next area that they were interested in is it being economical, of course. Thirdly, they were using Blackbaud NXT, and they wanted to be able to integrate with that. And fourthly, they also wanted to integrate with Blackbaud Merchant Services and send the payments through there. So this presentation is going to focus on the fourth part, integration with Blackbaud Merchant Services, or the integrated payments in the Payments API. I did a presentation yesterday talking about the event integration, sending those registrations to NXT. So if you're interested in that part, you can look at the presentation on BB Dev Days that I did yesterday. Okay, so whenever we're talking with a new customer, generally one of the main questions we ask is, okay, what payment gateway do you want to use? Now, we ask this because we don't receive, store, or transmit credit card details. We never have, and well, never say never, but we probably never will. Why? Because we use third-party payment gateways. So we were using Braintree before they were acquired by PayPal, but we have PayPal integrations and Braintree integrations and Stripe and CyberSource, and probably 7 others. So we generally say these are the ones we use, but are you interested in others? And we can look into doing that integration. So when the prospective customer came to us and says, can we use Blackbaud Merchant Services? Well, then, of course, we did our research. And I was looking into it. We said, oh, look, Sky API. Okay, great. We can use this and we can integrate with Blackbaud Merchant Services to send the payments. Okay, so before we jump into a little bit more of this, I just wanted to explain the general registration flow that Advancement Form has. So the main form that a registrant sees when they start registering for an event is just the main highly customizable form. They can choose, put in their contact information, say how many people are coming, put the different attendees and all the different activities they're going to. This all happens on the main form. Once they submit that information, they show what we call the payment page. It basically shows a confirmation and it gives a way to collect payment for that registration. Now, how that looks at the collect payment stage is based upon the payment gateway they're using. So the payment flow is dependent upon each integration. Like Blackbaud Merchant Services, they actually open up a payment modal. There are other services that actually embed a form on the page, or maybe you get sent to a separate page on that payment gateway site to fill in your credit card information. But once that transaction has been successfully processed by that payment gateway, control is returned back to us, and we direct them back to what we call our thank you page. So it's basically thanking them for their registration and giving them the final confirmation and details with regard to their event. So just something to keep in mind is that these 3 phases are generally how we do the registration flow. And each of the payment gateways has fit into this registration flow. So when we started looking into Blackbaud Merchant Services integration, we were happy that it would easily fit into our existing payment flow scaffolding. So we had existing methods and page endpoints that we're using, and it was able to easily fit inside of those. And I would say the coding part of it, I would say what I'm saying on point 2 here is it's probably the easiest payment integration we have done. It's probably has a little bit more boilerplate things you do pre-code, but the actual coding, it's relatively minimal compared to some of the other integrations we've done. Now, there are some different flows. So we chose the standard flow, which is basically for card not present transactions that you're doing online. So just keep that in mind. If you're looking at the documentation, we implemented the standard flow. Okay, so this is my suggested process. It kind of takes some of what's listed in the Blackbaud documentation and just shifts the order just slightly. But these are the 5 steps I would walk through. So first, make sure that you can already send Sky API calls or just enable the Sky API. Next is to enable the Payments API. Third, set up the authorization process to make sure your application can talk to Sky API. Fourth, collect the customer details for processing payments. This is basically identifying, make sure you have the unique identifier of the customer as well as the merchant account the funds need to go to. And finally, set up the payment flow, and this is where basically the coding happens in your application. Okay, so the first step here is to enable Sky API. And throughout some of the slides here, you'll see I have links to the main Blackbaud documentation. So you can think of This slide deck is maybe a Cliff Notes version of those. So it just kind of gives you an overview. But if you want the details, definitely work through the documentation. And I tried to have the numbers align up with some of what was in the Blackbaud documentation. So first, you want to sign up for a Sky Developer account if you haven't already, and then create an application. So it needs some type of application to get keys to be able to access things. And then sign up for an API subscription. Those from more recently, there's a free version you could use, or there's also the paid version that you can use. And then I would start reviewing the endpoint reference, and you can even connect the Sky API console so that you can use it within the endpoint reference to send sample calls. So this is great to do a test and say, okay, everything seems to be working, and at least get familiar with the Sky API if you haven't already. So after Sky API is enabled, I would then enable the Payments API, because this is a separate API. It has its own keys. And again, use the link reference here to follow along with kind of the abbreviations I'm mentioning. So number one, your client must grant you access as a Payments API user in their application environment. And they also must set up a Blackbaud Merchant Services account configuration if they haven't done that already. Two, you need to subscribe to the Payments API. So this is a separate subscription from the Sky API. And so again, you get your own separate keys to access. Third is, now that you've had the subscription and you can send transactions, use the endpoint reference in the Sky API console to get a payment configuration list. So that just validates that steps 1 and 2 are working, and you can move forward from there. Fourth in the documentation is to create a Sky application. But again, with my recommendation, you've already done that in the previous step. 5, the client admin needs to connect their environment to your Sky application. So that integration needs to be done from their end. And then the client needs to set up a user with permissions to perform calls to the Payments API. So if we look at the authorization, the thing about it is that user must, point 6 here, the user must have access to specifically the Payments API in order to make those calls. So they need to set up that user. So once you've enabled the Payments API, the next thing is to set up authorization in your application. So in terms of prepping the authorization, so be aware this uses OAuth 2. So it uses a first-time user interactive authentication process, which is why that user needs to have access to the Payments API or permissions to do so. And then after that user interactive process, access to the API is maintained by refresh tokens. And like I've mentioned, the user permissions determine what you can access in the API. Now, at this stage, the point bullet number 2, you also need to determine whether your application is considered public or confidential in terms of whether secrets can be safeguarded. So for us, we are using Ruby on Rails as our application framework, so we can store things on backend servers. So we're using the confidential, are considered a confidential application. Okay, so the first step of enabling authorization in your application, and this implementation is kind of up to you. So if you look at the screenshot at the top right, we have a button in our application where you can enable the Blackbaud integration. And when they click that button, what it does is what step 1 indicates is it enables the integration by setting up a way to store token state in our database. So it's just a very simple call to create a row to be able to update that information. Now, as soon as that is enabled, you'll see a screenshot on the lower right where now you can either disable the integration again, or you can authenticate with Blackbaud, or you could call it authorize with Blackbaud. That is a link that is indicated on step 2. So the link for that button is the link in step 2. It contacts the authorization endpoint for the OAuth service. You include your client ID that's from your application. You include a response code of code. You include a redirect URI. So this is an endpoint in your application that must be able to receive a call from Blackbaud. You must also include a state. We use this as a random hexadecimal string, so we create one for every new authorization request, and we store that in the token that's created in our system. And then the last thing you need to attach if you're doing public, so if you're doing a confidential application, you don't have to, but if you're doing a public application, you also need to do proof key for code exchange. So that needs to be included as well. So once users click on that button, they're redirected to Blackbaud. They log in if they need to, and then they choose the particular environment that they want to connect. So once that's done in our application in the top right, it says, oh, sorry, I skipped a step. Let's go back here. So once they go to Blackbaud, log in, choose their environment, at that moment, the step one happens here. So Blackbaud separately sends a request to your redirect URI. So that is the endpoint that you've set up to accept Blackbaud to call you with a post request. And that request from them is going to include a code and state parameters. So step two, you must send them a post request to Blackbaud. So you use the state parameter from step one, and we use that to find the unique authentication request or authorization request. Because if you remember, for every new authorization request, we create that uniquely. So now we can match that up to know where we have identified the right token that needs to be refreshed. And then use the code parameter from step one to submit a post request to the token endpoint. So it's the OAuth2 endpoint/token with the grant type authorization token. Now, after that post request, you get a response, and you store the result of that post request in your system. We store it in our database, and that returns an access token, a refresh token, along with their expirations. So once that's done, step four says success, and in the top right image, you see Blackbaud is authorized. So at this point, the authorization is successful. You have the victory image here, but the problem is it only lasts for an hour. Why? Because your access token is only allowed to be active for 60 minutes. So that is the purpose of the refresh token. So basically, if you want to continue accessing the API and you use the access token to do that, you need to send a refresh token to get a fresh access token. So you send a request to OAuth2/token and with a grant type of refresh token. So once you send that request to them, you will get back a new refresh token and a new access token with updated expiration dates, and you store that state information so that you can continue doing API requests. Now, how often you refresh this is up to you. What we do is that we send this request when the access token has less than 10 minutes left. You could alternatively choose to check for the expiration date on each API call and refresh the token if it expired. But for us, option one has worked well so far. Okay, so at this point, you should have your application authorized with Sky API, and you should be able to send requests. So the next request you need to do is to be able to get information that you would need to use the payments API. So like the slide says, you need to collect the customer details to process these payments. So step one is to get the public key. And the public key, like the second comment here, is essentially a unique organization identifier. And you send a GET request to payments/v1 select checkout/public key to get that. And next thing you need is the payment configuration ID. And this is equivalent to essentially the merchant account you should use to process payments. And you send that request to payments/v1/payment configurations. Now, you would need to store these values because they're used when you set up your transactions for doing payment processing for a given customer. So you store these to be able to process payments. So once you have those and you have them successfully stored, now's the time where you can actually get to start coding. Now, I'm going to walk through this overall payment flow. The colorful buttons you see here are essentially actions that have happened with a brief description through each one. So the first action that happens is a user lands on the payment page. If you remember what I discussed, how Advanced Inform works, the middle page is essentially the payment page. So when they land there, this is what happens or needs to happen with regard to a Blackbaud checkout experience. So first, you need to prepare transaction data object with some required values and run bbcheckout 2.0.js. And we're going to show the details in later. This is just a brief overview. And then you register an event listener on some type of payment button to run Blackbaud Open Payment Form. So it basically sets the stage on this page. The next action is user clicks payment button. That opens the Blackbaud Merchant Services payment modal and asks users for their credit card information. The users fill out that information. They can optionally change the billing details if you included that as well. The next action is the user clicks finish in that modal. At that point, this information is transmitted to Blackbaud Merchant Services, but important point is the card is not charged yet. What they do is they store that information and send you a transaction token back, either via a hidden form or via a JavaScript callback. And again, we'll look at the details of this. The next action that needs to happen is that you need to send a charge request. So you send a post request to payment/v1/checkout/transaction, and you include the amount and the transaction token you received from the Blackbaud modal. This is what actually charges the card. Once that's done, next action would be you need to complete the transaction. So basically, once this card is successfully charged, what we do is we mark the transaction as complete, and we present the user the thank you page, essentially. Okay, so let's go over each of these. So the user lands on a payment page. So again, you need to include the Blackbaud checkout JavaScript with the link shown here. You need to create a transaction data JavaScript object. Here's an example of including the key. This would be the public key, but they call it key in the JavaScript. And then the payment configuration ID you want to use, as well as an amount. And I think the only benefit of this is it does show in the Blackbaud modal what the amount is going to be. And then you set up some sort of payment button with a JavaScript event listener to say when that button is clicked, run Blackbaud _ open payment form, and you pass in that transaction data you defined. Now, with regard to the transaction data, we showed you include let's go back and just look at that. In this example, the transaction data includes the key, payment configuration ID, and amount, but there are a whole host of other options you can add. What we have chosen to add to the transaction data is the cardholder name. That's what cardholder means here. The billing address for the email and the actual address of the individual. And the Blackbaud modal has a place that you can click on to be able to look at those values and update them. And there are tons more options to be able to pass additional information or configuration to the modal that you can use at the link here. Now, another thing that happens throughout this payment process is that there are different events that get fired from the Blackbaud payment modal. They are checkout ready, loaded, cancel, complete, error. So what checkout ready does is, let me see if I can find a good way to show this. Okay. So checkout ready, essentially, I'm going to jump to this one. What checkout ready is essentially when the user lands on a page and all this JavaScript is ready. That is when the ready event fires. The loaded is when the user clicks the payment button. So when the modal loads on the screen is when that appears. And then cancel is when they've canceled. Complete is when they've clicked finished and everything's complete, or an error can also be triggered. So these are events you can essentially listen for. So let's look at the code to do this. Now, this code was taken from the Blackbaud website, but I've cut out sections. I've tried to make it as small as possible to be viewable on a screen. So if you look at line 25, here we are including the Blackbaud Checkout 2.0 JS. If you look at line 1, this is the button. So the Donate Now button that a donor would click to be able to make the contribution. And then everything between the script is the JavaScript that does it. So you could see on line 4, this is the transaction data where we're setting up the key or the public key and the payment configuration ID. In line 9, we are adding that event listener to that Donate Now button so that when it gets clicked, this code gets run. And essentially line 10 says, well, don't do what a normal button does, prevent the default. Number 11, we are adding the amount from another amount field that exists on the screen. This is more clear if you look on the example, but basically you can set the amount here, or you can set the amount when you're actually creating the transaction data. And then line 12 is actually what opens the modal Blackbaud open payment form and pass in the transaction data. Now, with regard to the different triggers and the code that you can run for them, you could see in line 15 through 22 the different event listeners that exist. And you can see under Checkout Complete, number 8, line 18, what it's doing is just displaying in the console log of the browser on line 20 what that transaction token returns. So Complete sends that transaction token there. Now, you can add as much other code to this to enhance the experience of the user. And here are some things that we did. So to check out Complete, we chose to disable the button. So in other words, they can't click the payment button again. We chose to change the text to please wait. So again, more of an indication not to click the button. And then we show a little CSS spinner that appears. So it just spins, letting the user, letting the user know that something is happening. In addition, if you remember, when we're looking at this, under the action user clicks finish in modal, it returns that transaction token either via a hidden form or a JavaScript callback. And we just looked at what the JavaScript callbacks look like, but we actually chose to use a hidden form. So it actually submits a form to an endpoint in our application, and that's where we take the transaction token to prep it and to send the payment request to Blackbaud. All right, in terms of the hidden form, you need to make sure it has a data attribute of form type equals BB checkout. And then the payment modal will know to go ahead and submit that form once the modal is complete its work. Okay, back to this payment flow we've looked at. So we covered action number 1, user lands on a payment page. Action number 2, user clicks the payment button. It opens the modal, and then user fills that information. Action number 3, user clicks finish in the modal. Now we're at the point where they're kind of waiting, like imagine the spinner spinning that I mentioned. You need to send a charge request to Blackbaud to actually charge the card. So that's the next step, send the charge request. So you send a post request to the payments API to payments v1/checkout/transaction. You include the transaction token received and the amount that needs to be charged. And on success, the card is charged. And I put this note in here, be sure to handle 200 and 201 response codes, because PayPal success returns a 201 with minimal information. And if we have time, which I think we will, I'll show you in the endpoint documentation that information. Okay, so here is like a very minimal example of how you could process and send a payment transaction. This is code in Ruby. So we have a process method that accepts an amount. The order ID is basically the transaction identifier we have, and then parameters received. And those parameters would be like the transaction token. So in line 2, we're basically using the customer's account, which was captured elsewhere, to actually find the access token to be able to use the API. Line 4, we're setting up the endpoint we want to contact. Line 5, we're establishing it to be a post request that needs to happen to that particular endpoint. Line 8, we're setting up as a content type of JSON because we're sending JSON. Line 9 is the subscription key for the payments API. So that needs to be your payments API subscription key. Remember, that's different from the normal Sky API access key, or subscription key. And then send an authorization, and that's where you send your access token for the Sky API. Line 13, we're preparing the request body that we're going to be sending them. So we're sending, again, the amount and the authorization token, which is essentially what the transaction token that was returned. And we convert it to JSON because that's what the API accepts. Then line 18 actually sends the transaction and receives the response back. So if we look at the next page, once we get the response back, if it's a 200, we're going ahead and parsing the results of that from JSON into the object storage of Ruby. Your implementation may be different, but we're basically converting it from JSON into a native implementation of Ruby. We're actually checking to see if the state equals process. I'm not 100% sure of every state that can exist. We've only ever seen states that have been processed. But we'll take a look at the endpoint. I think, it looks like we're going to have time where it looks at this, because we're more accustomed to payment gateways where when you have a response, a lot of times they have, was this response okay? Was there some sort of error? They do have different return codes, and we'll take a look at that. But just something to keep in mind. And we're actually going to be looking into or asking about what are the various states that are possible. And then if it's returning 201 in line 30, this is where you only get a location, which is a URL to direct to. And basically, we're parsing that in line 32 to get what is the unique transaction ID from the payment gateway. So this would be from Blackbaud Merchant Services, of course. And we craft a response based upon that. Because the response, when you get a 200, has very rich information. Again, we'll look at the documentation in a bit, whereas 201 is very sparse. Okay. So assuming you have a successful transaction, then what we do is we complete the transaction. So we mark the transaction as complete and we redirect the user to a thank you page. And that essentially completes the process. Now, that's pretty much getting everything up and running. We do have some, what I would call, instead of requirements and best practices, I would call them recommendations. So number one, I would tightly control any JavaScript that's on the payment page and even audit it. The reason for this is the new PCI DSS requirements. They have removed this auditing requirement for some of the different standard, basically SAC requirements. But I think they're going to be coming back. And I know that we have never allowed a customer to just insert any JavaScript they want anywhere in advancement form because of the risk of this potentially redirecting a user elsewhere. We do work with customers if they do need to add JavaScript, and we actually add it for them. So we've never allowed them to add it, but we always have to play a role in adding it and make sure they understand any risks, if any, that exists. So I would definitely be cautious about where you're embedding, this payment modal, and make sure it's as secure as you can make it. Two, next recommendation, I would overlog. I would log more than you think you need to. A lot of the code examples here, I have stripped out a lot of code to try and simplify it. So we definitely have a lot more logging involved, um, to be able to track anything that's going on and identify if there are issues. Three, I would definitely implement exception tracking if you haven't, because you want to understand if there's some sort of code breakage that's happening or bug that occurs. And then for error handling, be sure to handle all the different error cases you can, just to make sure as many people as possible are able to complete your transaction. All right. Now, we did have we had one main issue, um, and that was we overlooked the 201 response code for PayPal. Um, and it may not just come from PayPal. We haven't examined it, but basically, you only get a location. You don't get a very rich response. And actually, I think I'm going to take this opportunity to see if I can share my screen to be able to do that. Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing my screen. They should be. Okay. Um, oh, this actually may not be. Sorry, I think I may have gotten the wrong one. Try this again. Okay. So this is the checkout transaction. So this is the post request you send once you have a token. And as you can see, you send the amount and the authorization token. Those are the two required. You can optionally send the application fee, and it basically accepts JSON. So when you get a 200 response, you get a very detailed set of values returned to you. And it basically looks like this. However, if you get a response 201, the only thing you get is a response header. So it's not in the body. The response body is null. But in the response header, you get a location, which basically looks like this. So that's an example value. And what we were interested in, okay, we want to capture the unique ID. We don't actually need to visit that transaction necessarily, but we at least wanted to capture that unique ID. So we did end up setting up something to handle that. And you can see some of the different response codes that do exist for this when you're sending it: bad request, not found, conflict. Um, but I don't know, or I'm unaware if there's documentation, if there are different error codes with regard to problems processing a transaction. I don't quite know if they happen on um, the checkout modal. There are some different error states with that, but nothing related to processing a transaction. But again, the only other state that we've seen is processed. So I'm not quite sure if there are other states associated with it. And the other thing I'll mention is that if you're looking over the documentation, you'll see it says transaction state, which is the current processing state of transaction. It doesn't show what the potential values are. But that is actually for the state. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at the documentation. Um, my understanding is that transaction state is equivalent to state. Okay. All right, let's go back to the slides. All right. And I think that's pretty much it. If you're interested in learning more about advancement form, we are on the marketplace, so you can check that listing out if you're interested. And let's go ahead and do questions. But before we start looking at the questions in earnest, Judy, would you mind starting up the survey? The first question I see is, can I use Blackbaud Payment API in my WordPress site using WooCommerce that captures product quantity and amount to replace my Stripe payment gateway? I'm unfamiliar with the integration with WooCommerce, so maybe someone, b- member of the Blackbaud Merchant Services team, may be able to explain that. Um, Next question is, actually recently tested PayPal, Venmo, Blackbaud checkout or donation forms, and those checkouts tend to create empty batches. I was wondering how to do the payment details get patched to the batch. Oh, and the response was, let's connect out a session to look at that. Um, and the next question was about PayPal, Venmo with regard to batches and BBCRM, and Judy went ahead and answered that one. Okay, we still have a few minutes, so I'll wait a little bit for questions, but I guess I have a question for you. Do you have any um, projects you're planning and you're wanting to, want to learn and implement the payments API for them? And while we wait for that, if you're interested in contacting me, here's my LinkedIn. You can feel free to connect on LinkedIn, or you can visit advancementforum.com.
Creston, we do have a couple more questions coming in. Tina is asking, will integrated payments allow recurring gift types for third parties?
You can establish a recurring, excuse me, you can send a token with the request so that that card gets retained, and then I believe you can charge afterwards. We haven't implemented any kind of recurring gifts because for events, it's just one charge and done. So we're not storing any credit card information, but my understanding is that that can be vaulted to be able to do a recurring gift. Um, by third parties, I don't know if you mean uh, which third parties, or if you have clarification on that, that would be good.
And while we're waiting, Mark is wondering if using Stripe is any different.
Well, all the payment gateways definitely have their own idiosyncrasies and different ways they work. But essentially, they're charging the credit cards usually and offering credit card storage. So definitely, the visuals are different and the integration is different.
And we've got a few more questions coming in. You might want to take a look at Roland. It says he's looking at the pricing on your website. If you want both online giving and event registration for the starter level, he's confirming the cost.
Oh, those would be actually two separate fees. So one for a comprehensive online giving and one for the event. So that would be $200 a month if you wanted both solutions.
And what online store software other than WooCommerce works well with Blackbaud Payment API, particularly when selling product? And I may have to follow up on both of those to help out.
Yeah, unfortunately I'm not familiar with WooCommerce that well. Maybe there's other solutions that work with the Blackbaud Payment API. I mean, I know we have. I mean, advancement form. We also have a generic form builder component, and you can assign prices to particular things and charge cards. That's where there are institutions that do that with us. But I'm not quite sure what you mean about. But it's definitely not an online store. Like we're not, you know, an online store software. So that may be a different use case entirely.
All right, so I popped in the Q&A that I will connect on that WooCommerce question outside of the session. Do we have any other questions today?
Okay, well, let me see if I can finish answering Tina's question. So she
Oh,
said,
yeah.
will it? I'm sorry, what?
Go ahead.
Okay. She said, will integrated payments allow recurring gift types for third parties? And she's talking about third party online platform, not Blackbaud online giving. And my interpretation, yes, my interpretation is that this API was designed for third parties to be able to use the Blackbaud merchant services platform. On our roadmap is to integrate it with our online giving as well. And I know we're going to be using the uh, credit card saving technology that Blackbaud Merchant Services offers to be able to tokenize those cards to do recurring giving. So it should be able to.
Thank you, Creston. I missed it in the chat because I was looking at Q&A, so I
That's all
appreciate
right.
that.
That's all right.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A.
All right. Well, if no other questions, I guess we can go ahead and give people about 12 minutes of their day back. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Greatly appreciate it. Hope you have a great day and finish out BB Dev Days. All right. Thanks. Bye.